Let's move on to how I adjust my settings in order to capture these snowflakes. So the first thing to know is that number one, you're going to be shooting manually. You're not going to use any form of automatic focus. So you want to make sure that you've already set your lens towards manual focus as opposed to autofocus. Even though if you purchase, for example, Canon's own extension tubes, which are much more expensive, and you can use those extension tubes to directly impact the focus on a Canon lens, we actually aren't going to be using any autofocusing techniques whatsoever when shooting snowflakes. We're going to use our depth of field to focus, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But you want to make sure that's on manual focus. Second thing is you want to adjust your settings manually. So because this is not a Canon set of extension tubes, the camera does not detect what the aperture is on the lens over here. What I've done is, before I started shooting this video, is I've attached my 60mm lens directly to my Canon body and set the aperture to wide open. You want as much light as possible because, again, we're going to be magnifying that. In addition to that, you'll notice that I have the ISO set pretty darn high at around 800. When it's cloudy outside and I'm capturing snowflakes, I can push it maybe to an ISO of 400, but ISO 800 is fine. Now, of course, whenever you're shooting with a very high ISO, you risk getting a lot of grain with the image. But we're going to get rid of most of that grain in the process of doing what we call photo stacking, which is the post-processing technique I'll talk about at the end. So using a higher ISO is not usually as much of a problem. If possible, I'll shoot at 400, but the snowflake photo you saw at the beginning of this video was actually shot at ISO 800. Now, the last thing is shutter speed. Now, the shutter speed is really going to be fast, and the reason is even microscopic movements of your hand and body, which normally wouldn't be a big deal during regular photography, are a huge deal when you're talking about magnification photography. So when you're working at the macro level, even just your heart beating is enough to cause the subjects that you're going to be looking at, particularly when they're magnified 6 to 8 times, just even your pulse is enough to actually cause you to move. So the shutter speed needs to actually be quite fast. And because we're going to be working usually in lighting conditions which aren't optimal, you're talking about 1/100th of a second is probably the fastest, or actually I should say the slowest shutter speed you can actually use and still capture blur-free photographs. However, I can sometimes push it to 1/60th, but rarely. Now, another thing that people ask is, what about using a slider for macro photography or using a tripod? I don't use either. And part of the reason will become apparent when I show you how I actually shoot these photos. But in essence, I can't go very slow with the shutter speed because I'm not using those. The faster shutter speed is better, but because you're going to be working with very limited light, 1/200th of a second is about as fast as I'm going to ever be able to do. But those are the basic settings that I use when shooting snowflakes.